The number of doctors is up by 9,500, the number of nurses is up by 7,000, and the number of midwives is up by 2,200. We will train more because that is the way forward. There are issues within the NHS. Rupert mentioned privatisation. Under Labour, who were first to privatise the NHS, 5% was privatised. Under this government, there has been a 1% privatisation in the NHS. Privatisation does not mean you as the patient pay. That's a way of finding a cost efficiency. So, for example, with Macmillan Nurses, that's a private contract that goes out in terms of palliative care to a charitable organisation that's so specialised in dealing with people in their critical and families in their critical hour of need.
If I can just, cutting there, I just want to expand, I'll come straight back to you with this question, but perhaps if you can include some of the areas around mental health, because we had quite a few questions, particularly relating on how those two things tie in, so these are a couple more questions. Mental health services and support are essential, this question says, especially as it seems that more people are living with mental health issues. Are you going to put more money into mental health services?
There are three key things to being able to sustain a national health service. In terms of mental health, we're proud to have achieved the first ever waiting time targets in terms of mental health. So it's not as great as it should be, but it's the first time it's ever happened. It's 18 weeks under this government. We've also pledged a 1.25 billion into child therapy services. And these are successive governments, Julia's right, successive governments have neglected mental health. It's been a hidden illness, and we realise and we recognise the importance of it. And therefore, we are elevating the status of mental health to the same status as physical health. And there are a variety of reasons why in today's society, and I'm sure Rupert will touch on these, as to why mental health has become a big issue. But that's absolutely where we need to put the funding. And locally, we lack funding in terms of mental health. And it's actually about making that case to government. This is where you need a strong advocate who can talk to government, have the ear of government in order to get the funding that we require here in Cambridge. So, for example, there's a lack of diagnosis of children with autism between the ages of 12 to 17. That's a scandal. That's where we need to start getting more money into Cambridge. It's doable. We're the fastest growing economy in Europe, and if we continue on this path of growth, the more money we bring in, that's how we spend on the public sector.
Great, thank you very much. Julian, if you could perhaps expand on what you were beginning to say on mental health as well.
Yeah, so it's really good to have the questions on mental health, because time and time again it doesn't come up, and I have to push to get it mentioned. It is absolutely critical. 1 in 4 people will have a serious mental health condition at some point in their life, but we still consider it as a stigmatised thing. People find it hard to admit that they're depressed. They find it hard to get support if they do have a condition, and that absolutely has to change. So part of it's about that money. There's the 1.25 billion. There's 150 million also for child eating disorders. I hadn't realised until a couple of years ago that anorexia and bulimia are some of the biggest killers of young people. And typically we've waited until it becomes a physical problem rather than treating it early on. And that actually ties to what we need to do next. Yes, treat acute mental health problems, but more and more we need to do things about helping people not to have mental health problems. Public mental health. It's a really big issue. We have some ideas in our manifesto about that. But if you can reduce the incidence, and there's programs, there's a brilliant scheme in Norfolk schools to try to help people cope with mental health issues much, much better, that has huge benefits. The other question was about the third sector. I mean, there are also savings, by the way, in the police and many, many other areas. We have to get the criminal justice system out of mental health, which is the idea of the Crisis Care Concordats. Just to quickly touch up on the third sector, they play a brilliant role, and I've been involved with fundraising for groups like Centre 33, and just on Friday I was with the Blue Smile Project, which do a lot of work with primary age children, and it's brilliant work, and it's incredibly cost effective. It's about £1,000 to help a child at that stage, rather than waiting for things to go catastrophically wrong. That's where we should be directing a good chunk of the money.
Great, thank you very much. Daniel, same issues or same questions to you, please.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely true that mental health has been a Cinderella service for many years. Part of the problem is, although government can direct things, actually a lot of these decisions are made locally, and almost always the acute services, the big hospitals, are always the priority. So Labour is actually going to direct in a much more specific way to make sure that mental health gets a fair share of the cake locally. I'm hearing this increasingly from head teachers in Cambridge. There's a real crisis, particularly in young people's access to mental health services. Why there's a growing need and demand is a separate issue in itself. but it is quite clear that there are gaps in our provision in Cambridgeshire. And the sad truth is that actually spending on mental health in real terms across the country has actually fallen over the last few years. There's no doubt about that. So there is a real crisis, but what we're saying is that we will give people now a new right for access to talking therapies, for instance, a new path of training system to make sure that all health professionals are trained in mental health issues. It's surprising how often people don't really have much understanding and knowledge. So it's partly a question of changing the way you allocate resources, partly a question of changing attitudes. But I think it's absolutely the case that we're going to see more focus on mental health under the next Labour government.
Thank you very much. And Rupert, the same question to you.
Yeah, so let's talk about the causes of mental ill health. The number one driver of mental ill health is inequality. Societies that are more unequal have more people mentally ill in them. And our society, as it has become more unequal, has seen drastically growing rates of depression and anxiety. So what can we do about that? So the first thing we need to do is to reduce inequality. So for example, we in the Greens would bring in a wealth tax. We would tackle the assets of people with over 3 million to their names. That's a very, very small number of people with a very large amount of money. And that's a win-win because you reduce inequality and you provide the money to fund better services. We in the Greens think the concept of mental health emergency is a really important one. If somebody is thinking of killing themselves, that's an emergency, just as if somebody has a car accident and their leg is leading them to death. And I'm a strong advocate of talking therapies for mental ill health being much more strongly supported than they have been, especially mindfulness-based cognitive behavioural therapy. The coalition parties talk a good talk about mental health, but let's be absolutely clear about this. Over the course of this government as a whole, mental health has been cut. It was cut very severely. Those cuts have been partly reversed since then, but we still have a net cut since the start of this government. So that's the record. Finally, just to turn for 1 second again to privatisation, Hitchingbrook here in Cambridgeshire, privatised by the Labour government, completed under this current government. If you're asking what you need in your MP, I'll say what you need is someone to fight for what's right. And I'll fight for privatisation of the NHS, and I'll fight for decent funding for mental health.
Right, thank you very much. Jamali,
very quickly, I don't think we should neglect the valuable work that the various charities and specialist organisations do in terms of mental health. So this brings me back to my Macmillan point that I made earlier. The expertise is already out there, people who've been dealing with mental health issues for other people for a long period of time. And that's where some of our contracting out through the NHS could come in a very valuable level, or through local services. So we need to think about the bigger picture. The NHS is actually a big black hole. You can go in today with a stomach problem and they find out that you've actually got an underlying heart condition. How do you budget for that? It has to be treated under the Hippocratic Oath. So we need to be creative, and we need to look and recognise that maybe we don't have all those skills in the NHS, but those skills are out there, and we will train more people to help with that.
Daniel.
Yes, just one observation. 5 years ago, at this same event, no one asked about the health service. And I actually remember in my finishing comment saying, doesn't anyone want to ask about the health service? And I think that was because by that stage, actually the health service was performing remarkably well. And I think it's very interesting that those are our top questions today. I think it tells you all you need to know about the last 5 years.
Julian.
I was actually just going to look at this funding issue for mental health, because what we've actually seen is for many, many years, money not going into mental health. And many of you will remember David Howarth, my predecessor, campaigning about mental health cuts in Cambridgeshire. Sadly, it's nothing new. And when Labour set up waiting time targets for physical health, for good reasons, it meant that any organisation working out how to spend its money had targets on physical health they had to hit, no targets on mental health. So money always got moved over from mental health to physical health. That's happened for decades. That's why it is so important to have in law parity of esteem and the new waiting time targets that Jamali mentioned. They're not good enough. But hopefully what they will mean is that no longer will all the money be diverted. We have seen now, I think for 2 years in a row, increase in mental health funding. Partly because, for example, the latest slug that came in this month, the 23 million I mentioned, one of the rules was that a certain proportion of that had to go to mental health and could not be sucked away. I think that's really important. People are beginning across all the parties to realise that.
Thank you, and Rupert.
Well, just very briefly, I agree with what Julian's just said, but I do think it's very important when a government has been in office to judge it by its record. And the record states, the record shows that the coalition parties have reduced funding for mental health over this Parliament.
Okay, thank you. So that's we've now got a related question, but quite a specific question. I'm going to come to Rupert again with this one first. And it says this: there is likely to be a debate or a vote about assisted dying in the next Parliament. What are your views? How would you vote? How do you support, or how would you support or hinder this progress of this policy?
So I've been a passionate advocate of assisted dying since I was a student. I think it's wrong to prolong people's lives against their wishes. I have a living will myself, and it gives me a little bit of peace of mind that I have that. And I think everybody should have that right. So if there is a vote on this in the next Parliament, I will be strongly in favour of it, of course, with all the appropriate safeguards and so on and so forth. Simple as that.
Thank you. Daniel, the same question.
Sure. Obviously, some of you will know that there was a bill in Parliament which didn't get to the end of its progress before Parliament was prorogued, the Faulkner Bill. My view on this is, and this is an incredibly difficult issue, it's not a party political issue, it's a personal conscience issue. And I wrestle with this because I hear from people who feel very strongly on both sides of the argument. And I fully respect both sides of this. And I've heard some very, very strong cases made from people who actually work in palliative care. I have to say my own view, after thinking about it very, very closely, is that, of course, with all the appropriate safeguards, I think we have got a real problem with end-of-life care in this society now. I think we find it very, very hard to know how to deal with the end of our lives. It's a real struggle, and goes back to some of the health questions now. There are many, many very, very frail elderly people, for instance, and life is not great at that time. It really isn't great, and I do think it has to be a choice. Now, it's got to be an informed choice. There have got to be safeguards. We know all that. So I come down on the side of supporting the bill, but I fully respect those who take a very different view.
And do you think it should be a free vote?
Oh yeah, it should absolutely be a free vote. It shouldn't be on party political lines at all.
Okay, thank you. If we could take the same question, please, to Jamali.
The only real safeguards you can have for assisted suicide are where you go to a judge beforehand with 2 doctor's certificates, and you are given an assurance that if you do go down that route, the person who assists you will not be prosecuted. In reality, that is extremely costly, and it's something that we cannot provide, regrettably. So that would be the only safeguard to prevent you from prosecution for murder or manslaughter. From a personal conscience perspective, I can't subscribe to it. It's something that I feel could be abused, and I don't feel that we have the right to take a life, our own or someone else's. So I'm glad it's a free vote, and I would vote against it, particularly because I know that we cannot afford the real safeguards that would be required for it.
Thank you. And same questions to you.
There are people who are clearly able to articulate their desires to end their lives, and it seems to me that it is not right to prevent them from having that which they have articulated very clearly they want. So I would support some version of the bill. I think there are some tweaks, and it all has to come down to what those safeguards are. None of us would want to see a situation where people feel pressurised into this. None of us would want it to see it become normal for frail elderly or for disabled people. We have to make sure that never happens. It has to be a clearly articulated decision by somebody who is able to make that decision freely and fairly. We've seen people who have articulated this and argued this time after time after time. And I don't see how we can sit there and say that they don't really know what they want. I have respect for people who disagree with this, and I don't think, by the way, it's often phrased as a question of assisted dying or palliative care. And I don't think allowing one means you rule out the other. We can and must provide extremely good palliative care, because this shouldn't become the default option because we fail to provide anything else. We can provide both. Interestingly, the public is increasingly becoming supportive of it. There was a survey a couple of months ago now, which found that 84% of the public were in favour, and 80% of Christians, people who self-described as Christian, were also in favour. And that has changed very, very substantially. I know that's nothing like 100%, but I think it does show that if we can get those safeguards right, this is the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to a couple of questions now, looking at family life and the role of family in society. This question says this: apart from financial support and incentives, What would you like to happen in this country to help to establish secure relationships? What would you do to raise the significance of family life? And a kind of question similar, I'll come to Daniel with this one first. According to the Centre for the Centre for Social Justice, family breakdown in the UK costs the government in excess of 46 billion per year. I'm quite sure this is it. But what will you do to address family breakdown in the UK, both in terms of preventative and curative methods, and specifically in Cambridge? In a minute and a half.
Very good. Look, strong, successful families are really, really important and really good. But families in the modern world come in lots of different shapes and sizes. And Labour's not going to be prescriptive about this. And actually this is, again, rather about self-describing. So I think the key is actually early education. And I think one of the problems we've had is we haven't been educating people about relationships early enough in schools. And to some extent we've sometimes been leaving this to schools to make up their own minds. I think the world is changing. People are coming across a whole range of things which perhaps my generation didn't at a much earlier time in their lives. And we can partly protect people, but the best protection, in my view, is education and understanding. So I think that's the key to this. I think the idea that you try and incentivise people into particular forms of family structure seems very curious to me. I don't think people marry for money. I don't see that. I think offering them a few quid a week extra, that's not what people marry for. They marry for love. And that's what's important. And I just don't think that some of the things that we're hearing from the Conservative Party in terms of, to say, incentivising marriage is the right way to go. Because if you incentivise one thing, you then punish another thing. We are a very, very diverse society these days. And we've got to be very, very careful about the signals that government sends out. Because if it says one form of relationship is good, for many other people, that will feel like they are being stigmatised because they're not in that form of relationship. That's what I would do.
Thank you very much. Same question to you, Julian.
I agree with some of what Daniel said. I think relationships education would be very helpful. But it's also about things like making counselling available for families so that if a couple are starting to argue, there is access to people who can help and guide them through it. Because disagreements in a relationship are fairly normal, and some external advice, whether it's through a pastor or through a trained counsellor, or whatever it may be, is quite helpful. But I think the broad question is what government should be trying to achieve. And I've been arguing for a long time that we need to start looking at broader things than just economic growth, GDP. Because, and the panellists have all heard me say this several times, GDP is a rubbish measure of what we should actually care about. If we were to smash this room up and then fix it, GDP would have gone up. But I don't think any of us would think our lives were in any way better. And what I would like to start doing, we've been trying to do this in government, we've got a little bit of the way, is to actually look at what's called well-being. How do people feel their lives are? It's more than just happiness, it's much, much deeper than that. And then we should start to measure that and start to actually, for example, have well-being impact assessments. If you have a policy, what is it likely to do to people, to humans? And we know that money makes a big difference to well-being at the lower end. And beyond that, it's much more about whether you have friends, whether you have hobbies that you feel like, if you're religious, do you go to church? There's a whole lot of factors that are more important, your relationships. If we started thinking about things that affect humans when we're designing policies, we'd make far more sensible policies for humans.
Thank you. Same question to Jemima, please.
Thank you very much. So I come from what might be described a very traditional family. And whilst I subscribe to the idea that families do come in all different shapes and sizes, at the last election, some of you will remember that the Conservatives talked about the idea of a big society. And of course the media said, no, it's not possible. In this day and age, there's no sense of community. But actually what you have here, this group, this church group, is a community. And you've probably lent support to other people. Maybe it might be financial, it might be in terms of an ear to or a shoulder to cry on, or just in terms of people feeling like they belong. And I think that's where society as a whole, there are disenfranchised groups, people who feel disconnected and disengaged. How many of us really know our neighbour? So actually, I do believe in a big society, and I think it's achievable, because we believe in the Conservative Party that strong and stable families, whatever shape or size they come in, lead to a strong and stable society. The Lib Dems, were one party that blocked our desire to drive down the cost of childcare. And having that childcare provision is very important, and it means that parents can go out to work if they need to, if they want to. So one of the things that we would look to do is try and reduce the cost of childcare so that people aren't put off by having children. In terms of what we can do in Cambridge, I was recently at Relate, which is an organisation that looks at relationships between families, or with boyfriends and girlfriends, or marriages, or anyone really, any kind of relationship. And there again, you have specialist expertise that we can draw upon, and this is there in our society. So we look to get them funding through local authorities and through central government.
Thank you. Just before coming to Rupert, did you want to just cut in on that?
Yes, I mean, the thing about childcare was a question about what the ratio should be. Conservatives wanted to say that one person could look after twice as many children, and we felt that while, yes, it would be nice to have the costs down, we'd also quite like good quality childcare.
Okay, thank you. Rupert?
Well, I actually agree with quite a lot of what the other candidates have said on this question so far. A little bit of consensus breaking out here, perhaps. But I would go further in the following sense. In my opening remarks, I spoke about a spiritual crisis, and I think we're not really going to get real progress on this vital set of questions that has been asked until some really basic things in our society change. I think that a society which values money above everything else, and a society which is as incredibly consumeristic as we are now in this country and in much of the world, is a society which is always going to find it very difficult to take relationships and families seriously. Because basically, when you're in a world where it seems like everything can be bought and sold, where advertising is always telling you it's about you are the most important thing, you can make yourself complete by buying this product, then it's very difficult actually to deeply and profoundly value the kind of things that are involved in family, to value love in the way that love should be valued, to understand what a stable relationship is, something that can't be bought and sold, something that doesn't just chop and change with the latest fashion or the latest craze or gizmo or what have you. So my belief is that really we're not going to actually make deep progress on this issue until we actually start to change the fundamental way in which we do society and do our economy. And that's what the Green Party wants to do, to make that kind of fundamental change, to turn us into a society which is less fixated on buying and selling material things and more based in what actually makes us happy.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move now into a huge issue, obviously, that many people have questions about. Perhaps we might extend the time to 2 minutes for this one, because it's a big issue, and then we'll throw the doors wide open. And we'll start with Julian. How exactly does your party plan to reduce the deficit?
Easy questions first.
Easy question, yeah.
So, I mean, firstly, the challenge over the 5 years has been to deal with that colossal deficit, and whoever's fault you think it is, when we started in 2010, for every £4 the government was spending, one of those was being borrowed. You know, you clearly can't go on like that. The question is, what do you do now? And our view is that you close the deficit by 2017-18, and from then on there are two choices. Do you continue to constrict, which is what the Conservatives have said, or do you say, we've done the hard bit, now we can allow public spending to grow because we've balanced the books? And I'm very much in that camp. And we've set out some very, very detailed things of what we would do up to 2017 and 2018. We were praised by the IFS for being the most detailed, which is probably not saying all that much, actually, of all the parties, but we have laid it all out. And I have a table here which I'm not going to read out to you, but you can have a look at it online. But essentially, we would use about 50-50 mixture of tax increases versus spending cuts. And that actually means we would reduce the pace of spending cuts in departments from what we've had over the last 5 years. A much slower rate and more taxes. You may ask, what are those taxes? Some of it is about closing more loopholes. There's a tax dodging bill I've been working on with Oxfam and Christian Aid and others, and that raises some of it. We would also continue with the work we've done to lift poorly paying people out of paying income tax, which costs more, but the rest of it is things like aligning dividend tax so that you pay the same rate as you do for income tax to make less incentives for people to fiddle the books. That raises about 1.2 billion a year. A supplementary corporation tax rates for banks raises another £1 billion a year on top of the bank levy we've already had, which raises 10 billion a year. So there's a range of things, but they do add up. And that, I think, is really important. So it's a slower rate of cuts, more tax collection from the rich, giving more tax for people, lower earners to keep, and then once we fix the problem, to grow the economy, have public sector pay increases and all the rest.
Thank you very much. Same question to Rupert.
Yeah, so let me first say what we wouldn't do. We wouldn't carry on with austerity. We wouldn't cut good things. We wouldn't cut local government further. We wouldn't cut social security further. And in that regard, we're different from all three of the other parties. Conservatives would make savage cuts, Lib Dems less savage cuts, Labour even less savage cuts still, but still cuts. We wouldn't do that. What would we do? We would cut bad things instead. Right? Not good things, bad things. We would cut Trident nuclear missiles. We would cut fossil fuel subsidies. We would cut nuclear subsidies. We would cut the HS2 vanity project. And we would tax things which it's good to tax. As I said earlier, we would tax wealth. We would put the top rate of income tax up to 60% on the very richest. 60% was the rate, by the way, that it was set at by that extremist, firebrand socialist Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And if she thought that 60% wasn't too high for the top rate of income tax, then it shows you something about the other parties here, that they're not willing to contemplate the top rate going that high anymore. We are. So that's the basic approach within the Green Party, to make sure that the process of deficit reduction is not one which involves cutting good things, and is one that involves cutting bad things, to put it in simple but true terms. One final point. There's been a lot of quantitative easing under this government, and since the financial crisis. That's been an enormous free gift to the super rich in our society. What we ought to be doing instead is green quantitative easing. What that basically means is that government brings new money into existence, not by basically giving it away to the super rich and to banks, but by spending it into existence, by putting into being green infrastructure, by making every house in the country well insulated, every public building well insulated, a huge rollout of renewable energy. That's green quantitative easing, a way that we can have good things without having to increase the deficit.
Okay, thank you very much. And the same question to Daniel.
Probably the most important question. And let's start by just looking back to where we were 5 years ago. At that election, the key difference between the parties was David Cameron was promising to eliminate the deficit within this Parliament. It wasn't just an economic aim, he said, judge me by it. He said, if you fail to do that, then you have morally failed. So here we are, 5 years on. At the time, Labour said the realistic aim was to halve the deficit. So where are we 5 years on? Not even half. Frankly, David Cameron not only should be apologising to the British people for what's happened, he really has got no right to be standing for election again, given that fundamental failure to achieve what he said was the test. So, what would Labour do? Well, we certainly wouldn't have done what this lot did, which, if you remember that famous dramatic intervention soon after the election when David Laws, the Liberal Democrats, and George Osborne announced from the Treasury that everything had to be cut and slashed. And of course what that did was it sent the economy into a tailspin, which meant that for 3 years we were still going backwards, and we've only just got back to where we were 5 years ago. So Labour's approach last time, actually, same this time. We don't think you do it in 3 years, as Julian described, because we think we'll have exactly the same problems as last time. The slash and burn of the next year or two will send the economy into a tailspin again, and we'll be exactly in the same cycle. So Labour will move more slowly. And if you ask yourself why the government's failed, it's because it's created a low-pay economy, and people aren't paying enough taxes as a consequence. So we will tax people at the top more, we'll reintroduce a 50% tax, we'll introduce a mansion tax, we'll deal with the non-DOMs, but we'll also raise people at the bottom through raising the minimum wage by £3,000 a year by 2019, by in cities like Cambridge pushing really hard for employers to pay what they could afford, a living wage. And that way, as it ripples up through the labour market, what we'll find is a stronger, healthier economy. So it's not just a moral issue, it's about what works. This government has got it wrong. It hasn't worked. Give our planet a chance. It will work.
Okay, thank you very much. Jamali, same question to you.
I can't do an impersonation of Ed Balls, but some of you will remember him screaming in Parliament and saying, "Where's your plan B? Where's your plan B? Where's your plan B?" Actually, plan A was not a bad plan after all, and we have managed to get the deficit down. The reality is there is much further to do, but there's certain things that we would put in place in the Conservative Party if we were elected to government again. So firstly, our corporation tax regime is now the lowest in Europe, actually the lowest in the G20, and that has encouraged more businesses to locate here and pay that 20% tax. Since records began, that's 1948, we've seen that the deficit was the highest of any political party under Labour. It was at 10.2%. The reality is you can't spend what you don't have. And if you borrow, the people who end up funding that borrowing are the next generation. So we don't want to saddle them with further debts. We can cheapen the cost of government. We may look at reducing the number of MPs in Parliament. The way to do that, we need to look at trimming Whitehall, and we need to look at cutting our MPs and the expenses that they have. I'm not going to go into the expenses of certain MPs, but we all know someone who's got one of the highest expenses in the Eastern region. I'll leave you to figure out who that is. Cracking down on tax avoidance. Under this government, we've actually saved 85 billion through tax avoidance and evasion. And that is another area where we need to go gung-ho in the next Parliament in order to raise more money for this country. So there's lots of things that we want to put in place. We can't put them in place unless we are elected to government.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you for those answers. We're going to move on to another issue, but obviously they're all, I guess, in some ways related to that last one. And we'll come to Rupert with this one first, please. What do you see as the main areas of social need or social injustice, particularly within this city? And then how can the local church or local communities work with politicians better to tackle this?
Well, I think one place to start, obvious, important place to start, especially given where we are, is with food banks. Over 4,000 people in Cambridge depended upon them last year. This is an issue I've been working on for the last few years. Very, very important, very, very troubling. It's a clear indicator of how divided a city we have in Cambridge. And that's not right. It's a manifestation of the kind of cruel inequality that I've been talking about, and of the dire need for us to change our path to a more humane, equitable one, to become more of a community, more of a society, to have some kind of jubilee, if you will. I'm just going to mention some figures that have just come out from the UK Poverty Audit, the Stand Against Poverty group, just a few days ago. It's very, very interesting figures. They rated the different parties' manifestos on how good they were in terms of fighting against poverty. They rated them with scores out of 5. And going up from the bottom, UKIP 1.4, Conservatives 1.7, Labour 2.6, Lib Dems 3.2, Green 3.9. The Green Party manifesto was the only one which was judged to be adequate in terms of its policies to address inequality and to address poverty. As I think you can tell from what I've been saying this evening, this is an issue which I care about very, very strongly and would act strongly on if elected as your MP, both in terms of the situation in Cambridge and crucially in terms of the national situation, which we all depend on.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to the same question with Jamali. You mentioned food banks. I think, as you said, over 4,040 people were served by the Cambridge Food Bank, and 63% of those were people on low incomes within the city. So, Jamali, how do you answer that question about social injustice?
Thank you. So, under the last government, job centres were not allowed to advertise where the nearest food bank was. That doesn't mean people weren't in need of food. They were. So the fact that there has been a rise in food banks has been partly a policy shift to allow job centres to direct people to their nearest food bank. We'd love to see a situation where food banks went out of business, but the reality is you are helping people, and in Cambridge City, we probably are able to get to people, or they're able to get to us more easily than they are in rural communities. And I don't think there are any proper stats on the need for food banks in rural communities, because sometimes we just don't know how many people are out there. But it's about making people aware that food banks exist and giving them the option and ability to get to them. The primary question was, what's the main area of social need in Cambridge and how can churches tackle that issue? It's very difficult to pick the main area of social need. I believe that from my canvassing on the doorstep, I've met several children where I think it's a scandal in my view, who are being homeschooled not out of choice, but because they can't get their child statemented and into the school that they want them to get into to address their special needs. How can a church tackle these issues? One, being an ear and a voice to people is huge, but helping people find or direct them either to their MP or to a signposted organisation. That's one of the areas that I think a church can be involved in. I know this church is very involved in the food bank scheme, and I applaud those who are members of that and working with that.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Daniel.
Well, this is the reason I'm in politics, but it's a deep structural problem, and in Cambridge, perhaps more than most places, the divided city has been a long-term issue, and it's a fundamental thing in this city. But the sad truth is, the last 5 years, government policies have made it worse. The bedroom tax, for instance, totally unnecessary, was never going to work. It's just caused a huge amount of misery. How anyone could think it was a good idea to force people to move to homes that didn't exist is beyond me. So the government can stop doing things to make things worse. In wider sense, I think I've already touched on some of the things. The very low pay that people are suffering. No one's mentioned the 0 hours contracts yet. I've been struck in my canvassing by the number of people I'm talking to now who are on 0 hours contracts. And it's not the case that it's always a bad thing. Some people welcome the flexibility, but I have to tell you, the vast majority don't. And it's creating a real problem in the sense that people don't know how much money that's going to be coming in, don't know whether they can pay the rent, etc., etc. In terms of what churches can do, I think actually churches are already playing a very big role in this city, and I congratulate you on it. We've talked about the food bank. There are other things people are doing. I went out with street pastors a few months ago. Very impressive, the work that they do on Friday and Saturday nights. And some of the help with the homeless schemes in the city, again, very impressive. But in the end, I have to say to you, I think it needs government action and changes in policy. And these are big changes that are needed. Cambridge is a wealthy city. I do not understand why the university, for instance, could not, and the colleges, who are the prime culprits, can't pay a living wage to their staff. I couldn't understand when Microsoft moved here, why they couldn't have committed to a living wage. They're telling me now they probably are just about to do it. And this weekend we'll be pointing out that John Lewis don't pay their cleaners a living wage. There's something wrong with this society, isn't there? When wealthy employers don't do what they should do and live up to their responsibilities.
Okay, thank you. Julian.
I mean, first I do agree with Daniel on the living wage. It's something I mentioned in my opening speech, and I've been pressing the colleges and the university together with the Living Wage Foundation. We have managed to get some more employers to pay the living wage. We now have a number of cafes which do, but there is a long way to go on that, and that would make a difference, as does lifting poorly paid people out of income tax. Because if you're earning some of it and then £1,000 gets taken away, you have £1,000 less. What people actually care about is the money they end up with, not what it started off at. And can I pick up this thing about food banks? And again, I join everyone in paying tribute to all those who work with food banks. And there's no doubt that the fact that people need to use food banks is a bad thing. And it would be much better if people didn't. But the worst thing of all is people who need a food bank and don't have that help available when they need it. That is the worst thing. And what we've seen for many years, actually, before the change of government, is that every time a food bank was opened, there was demand for it. Now, that shows, I think, there's been pent-up demand for many years, and people have done informal things for many years. What I am incredibly heartened by is the fact that we've now seen a reduction in use of the food bank here in Cambridge, which to me suggests we finally got out to all the people who need that help, and we're now successfully reducing the number of people who need that. 14% reduction is good. We need to go further. What would I do about it? Much more about getting rid of sanctions and having a yellow card system. And I've been working with the Chief Executive of the Trussell Trust and the Job Centre Plus locally to try to come up with some solutions to that while I was still an MP. Just very quickly to pick up the issue about where I see the biggest issue other than those, I think it's in housing. And I particularly see it in the hundreds and hundreds of people in Cambridge who are massively overcrowded.
We've got a few questions actually on that. So
but if I just finish that sentence, where I see a family of 4 or 5 in a one-bedroom flat, they never get talked about, they never get picked up. Even our housing session, they weren't discussed. That to me is one of the biggest problems. We have to get more council housing and more social housing.
Thank you. We're going to come back to Rupert and then Joanna.
Yeah, just very briefly, I agree with the remarks that Daniel and Julian have made about the living wage, but we in the Greens think that it's not good enough to simply try to encourage firms and so on to pay a living wage. What we want to do is actually make the minimum wage into a living wage nationwide. We think that the minimum wage should be something you can live off. End of.
Thank you. Joanna?
very quickly on the issue of welfare to work. We were at the Papworth Trust a few days ago, Hustings there, and we found out that there was a lady who had been out of work for 10 years due to a disability. And she started, through the Papworth Trust, she managed to gain a voluntary position, and now she's getting paid work as a life coach. So I think there are examples, and the Papworth Trust has so many of these examples, where welfare to work has been successful. We want everyone who wants a job to be able to access a job, and that's what we call a position of full employment. And that's what we're aiming for under the next government.
Thank you. I'm just going to skip to the questions. We have quite a lot of questions about housing, so we'll perhaps go there now and come back to you, Tremana, straight on that one. Various questions. There are, with the need for more social housing across the city, there appears to be a lot of building projects that are only for private sale. How will you build more social housing inside the city where local communities and families want to stay close together and in contact with each other? And also, another two here, apart from building extra homes, how do you propose to help young people get onto the housing ladder? And also, more generally, what is affordable housing, affordable for who? So perhaps we could dive into the area of housing more fully, Tremana.
Okay, I'm going to try and race through those. I do get accused of talking very quickly, but I hope you can stick with me. In terms of affordable housing, what does it mean? It encompasses both social housing and housing for key workers, so your nurses, firemen, police officers. We have a system at the moment where it should be 40% of a new development is actually affordable housing. I live in Trumpington Meadows, and on the same street you'll have affordable housing as people who are council house tenants, as well as those who are key workers, and people who don't necessarily require affordable housing, who can buy at the market price for a property. That is a very good example in Cambridge of how it works, and it is on the 40% split, which is very good. Well, as a MP, housing is not necessarily within our remit locally. It's up to the discretion of the local authority. But I will work with key stakeholders to ensure that we meet that 40% target. In terms of young people getting them onto the property ladder, we have pledged to build 200,000 new starter homes. These will be homes available to those under the age of 40 to buy at 20% below market value, so that they, for the first-time buyers, so that they have the chance to actually access the property market. In Cambridge, we've seen property prices go up by 18% in 2014. They are now starting to dip. It's not enough. You do need to build more, so supply has to go up to overcome the demand in order to drive the prices down. But also one area where I would push for a bill in Parliament is to change the fact that developers at the moment, when you go along to a development to buy a property, a developer says, oh well, phase one has already been sold in Singapore, Hong Kong, China. Well, what's left for me to buy? And actually that's artificially inflated the market. So we could introduce legislation that says to developers, you either release phase one domestically and internationally at the same time, or better still, go one step further, release it domestically first.
Okay,
there's a lot to say on housing.
Yeah,
see you
all the
nodding.
issues tonight. Daniel, perhaps the same issue with you.
Yes, huge amount to say on housing. Look, first of all, we've got to build more housing. Labour is committed to a target of 200,000 homes by the end of this Parliament. Others will say that's not enough. We think it's no point setting unrealistic targets that won't be met. We think this is possible to do, and that will begin to address the shortfall. In terms of house prices in Cambridge, very difficult to see how you do that, but a lot of the developments at the moment are being bought by investors from outside. We're seeing that in Trumpington. So one of the things that Labour will be doing will be giving councils the opportunity to ensure that up to half of the homes on a new development are only available to first-time buyers, and that could have a significant impact. In the private rented sector, it's absolutely awful for people in Cambridge at the moment, terribly expensive. And just today, Ed Miliband has confirmed that we're going to be much, much tougher on landlords. Basically, 3-year tenancies will become the norm. It doesn't have to be 3 years, but that will be the norm, which will end this endless rent rises when short-term contracts, 6 months, are renegotiated and people are given the chance, the choice of either paying more rent or leaving. And that's a real problem in Cambridge, and cracking down on a lot of these nasty charges that creep in when people are renting. So there's a whole range of things that need to be done, but don't underestimate the degree of difficulty. There's one final point. This affordable housing target of 40% is rarely met because developers consistently have more power than councils. And there was just a recent example in Rustat Road where, far from being the 30% that was originally agreed, the developer got it down to 6%. and then sold those houses on a few months later for an astonishing £15 million profit. That was because of the changes that were voted in by this government to weaken the powers that councils have to insist on affordable housing. The answer is be tough on developers.
Okay, thank you. Be tough on developers. Julian.
Housing in 90 seconds. Firstly, we do have to get many more social homes. We've lost so many. Since 1979, we've reduced our stock by 1.5 million. The Tories reduced it by 1.1 million, and then Labour presided over a continued decline, 421,000 fewer social homes by the end, causing many of the problems that we have now. That has to be reversed, and we find it's the first government for 30 years to actually increase the number of affordable social homes by nothing like enough. Nothing like enough. But at least it's going up rather than down. Here in Cambridge, when we ran the City Council, we started a scheme to build 2,000 new council houses over a number of years. And finally we're able to build new council houses, which didn't happen before. I'd like to see the right to buy scrapped for any area that wants to, like Cambridge, because it is causing too many problems reducing that stock. I certainly wouldn't have the idea the Tories have been floating about the right to buy housing association houses. Again, that loses our social housing, and I was shocked to see Ed Bull saying he was up for it. Daniel, I certainly wouldn't. We have to do a lot of the price.
No, he wasn't actually.
Well, that's what he said, Daniel. Read Labour list. We'd have to do a lot of the private rent estate, and I agree with a lot of what Daniel's just said, partly because it was in a bill I proposed a few years ago in Parliament, so it's good to see that we do agree on that. Nationally, we have to have a huge amount of house building. 200,000 is just simply not enough, as Daniel accepts, to keep pace with the number of houses needed because of family breakdown, people living longer, the population. You have to get to at least 225,000 a year. If you try to do anything under that, you are trying to deliver something which will continue to give rising house prices. You have to get over 225,000 if you want to actually reduce the cost. So we would build 300,000 zero-carbon homes in a number of garden cities, for example, on an east-west rail link.
Okay, thank you very much. And Rupert.
Yes, so in terms of Cambridge, we would end most of the private house building in Cambridge, because the reality is that we don't have a housing crisis. What we have is an affordable housing crisis. So we want to replace that private house building in those luxury flats and so on with building affordable housing. Now, what is affordable housing? Well, the crucial thing about affordable housing is that it's not affordable unless it stays affordable. What that means is that real affordable housing is social housing, it's council housing. So the Green Party has a target of building 500,000 units of social housing during the next Parliament, and it has to stay that way. And what that means is you have to end the Thatcherite madness of the right to buy. It's not enough, by the way, just to end it in one place or another. You need to end it full stop, otherwise you're continually creating affordable homes that stop being affordable homes because they get bought and sold and so on and so forth. So that's a policy that actually adds up, that actually works. Finally, really important point, where would these houses be built, these affordable houses, these social housing? Well, all over the place, including, crucially, in places like here in Cambridge. But where we in the Greens differ from the other parties is that we don't think that it's okay to have plans that involve Cambridge expanding and sprawling out into the countryside forever. And we reject the idea of more and more road building, more and more road expansion. We think that the character of Cambridge is at risk at the present time. And what we would seek to do is to build quite a lot of those new social housing units in parts of the country where actually regeneration or development is more badly needed than it is around here. Places with more brownfields, places that need more put into their economies than Cambridge needs. Places in the North East, in the Midlands, and South Wales, and so on and so forth. In other words, return to regional policy in this country. Rather than just letting development let rip in the South East, as we've done for far too long, we would end that sprawling out and start to plan Britain in a more sensible way once again.
Okay, thank you very much. Back to Jemima.
I actually enjoy debating with Rupert because it takes fiction to new heights. That's the latest one of the economic policies that amuses me, because actually developers, it's very difficult to persuade them, right, you can only build affordable housing because they don't make their money. So what they want to do is they want to build the private houses at the normal or above market value. And in actual fact, it's about making sure they stick to that 40%. I accept there are places in Cambridge, Daniel cited one example, where they haven't stuck to the 40%, but that's where our local authority needs to be tough. Saving our green belt is extremely important, but also We're in Cambridge. It's a beautiful historic city with such fabulous architecture. You get down at Cambridge Station and you don't feel you've arrived in Cambridge. As you come in on the Hawkston Road, yes, it's a nice development, Trumpington Meadows. On the other side, you've got a development that actually resembles a prison that I've visited. And what's that about? So, you know, we need to think in terms of a vision for this city. Where are we going to be in 50 years' time? How are we going to manage the growth that nobody wants, but unfortunately is going to happen? And that is by building things that are beautiful and are in keeping with our city.
Okay, thank you. Just back to you.
Yeah, so Tamale talks about having vision, but it seems to me she has a complete lack of vision. Right, where's the political will? Tamale says, oh, it's difficult to get developers to put in affordable housing. Yes, it's difficult if you have no political will. We have the political will, and we would make them do it. It's as simple as that. That's what government is for, to return us to having enough affordable, decent social housing in this country, which Margaret Thatcher, then followed by Labour, got rid of.
It's not economically practical.
It is.
Okay, well, we'll leave that for people to decide. This, in a funny way, dovetails into the next question. We're being very orderly. We had a question which I quite liked. Prime Minister's Question Time is such a bad advert for politics. I think actually tonight's been an excellent, so thank you to the candidates so far. But how would you improve it, or do you think it's fine as it is? And perhaps also broaden into that question issues surrounding parties working together, which they may well have to do after the coming election. Perhaps Daniel, we can go to you with this one first.
Well, this is what people always say, isn't it? It's extraordinary because actually Prime Minister's Question is hugely popular across the world. And the reason it's popular, of course, is the appalling behaviour of Prime Minister's Question Time. And that's just one of those things which is in the nature of human beings, I guess. And every person who's always elected leader of a political party that might be Prime Minister always starts off with pious intentions about, David Cameron said, no more Punch and Judy. Well, you know, how long did that last? And it's a problem, structurally, and I know that Julian's been on the receiving end, and I'm sure he'll have some things to say about this. What Ed Miliband has said is that he will actually have kind of like a second version of PMQs, but with members of the public, who I think will probably be slightly better behaved than the members of Parliament. But one thing I would say is, for anyone who's actually been down to Parliament and in the chamber, on the television you don't really get a sense of it. It's very small. People do get heated and exercised. And you know what? I'm glad they do, because there's some really, really big issues at stake. So I wouldn't have it less passionate. When people are doing pretty horrible things like the bedroom tax, I want people holding those people to account. So, you know, if you're asking me how will I behave, well, providing it's a government doing decent things, I'll be just fine.
Julian, perhaps from personal experience.
I mean, I think the way PMQs behaves is awful. I think it's a phenomenal loss of an amazing opportunity. You know, you can't imagine many countries in the world where the leader would be answering questions every week. I can't imagine Obama doing it. I certainly couldn't imagine Bush doing it. And yet most of the questions are a complete waste of that. Just under half the questions are essentially of the form, does the Prime Minister agree that he is evil and trying to destroy all that is good in the world? And the other half is saying, does the Prime Minister agree that he is brilliant and responsible for all that is great? And then there's a couple, and only a small handful of things that are actually questions, or people are actually trying to push things forward. And I think it's a phenomenal, phenomenal lost opportunity. And I really think it's disgraceful. And the behaviour is simply astonishing. It's the sort of behaviour that if it happened in this school, those pupils would be suspended or expelled for. You know, Daniel refers to the fact that there was a group of Labour MPs who would unite to groan a bit whenever I spoke. And it was the same group who would go and target somebody different periodically. So for a while, there was a Tory MP, Paul Maynard, who has cerebral palsy. And so for a while, whenever he spoke, he has a slightly contorted face, they would pull faces at him. You wouldn't allow that in your school. You know, I see shakes of the head. It was the same group who've made gestures like that when there are women called to speak. You know, it is astonishing. And it's not, there's a group of Labour ones, there's a group of Tory ones who do it. And it is absolutely disgusting. And the sad thing is that when you turn the cameras off, actually most of us get on quite well. There are Labour MPs, Tory MPs, a Green MP I have worked with incredibly closely in my time in Parliament. We've worked together, we've delivered things, we've changed bits of the law, and we do that behind the scenes. And I think if people could actually see us doing that, working together to fix things, politicians would get a much better reputation.
Rupert, same question to you.
Yeah. So I think the big issue really underlying this question is problems in our political culture in this country to do with our adversarial system, which I think in turn follows a lot from the first past the post electoral system and the fact that historically there were two parties facing each other in Parliament and it was quite a simple situation. Of course we've outgrown that now. So I think as we move forward and start to become more creative in dealing with the multi-party system that we have now, I think it's quite possible there'll never be a majority government of one party in this country again. We have to get used to that. We have to change our electoral system to proportional representation. And I think when we do, that might be a big step forward in terms of moving closer to a slightly more, if you will, continental system of how to do politics. In quite a lot of countries in Europe, politics is less adversarial, less Yabu sucks, etc., than it is in this country. Some of you will have a kind of sense of that from Borgen, for example, the wonderful TV series from Denmark, which shows something about how you can do politics in a different way. In Borgen, there are leaders' debates involving 7 leaders from different parties. Oh, we've arrived at that now in Britain, in this country. So I think that after this election there will be huge pressure to change the electoral system, absolutely rightly so. I think that when we do, and possibly when we then start to think about doing things like changing the shape of the chamber in Parliament to make it less adversarial and confrontational, I think we then might start to get a more healthy relationship between the various leaders within Parliament.
Yeah, I actually went to the Parliament in Denmark and noticed that it is almost circular. It's completely different. And
Churchill insisted.
Oh really? There we go, Churchill. Didn't get everything right. Smiley.
So I come from a family where Sunday mornings were spent watching Breakfast with Frost, and then the channel was changed to Midlands Westminster, and we literally, from the age of 4, I can remember watching political programmes on a Sunday. And eventually we'd get to BBC Parliament or an extract from BBC Parliament, and to be fair, when I stay at my parents' house, it's the same thing. My dad has BBC Parliament on. And unless you watch BBC Parliament regularly, you don't actually see some of the good work that happens in the House of Lords, where they really get into the minutiae of debating legislation and whether it will work and putting in safeguards to legislation. PMQs is sensationalised. It's that little bit that everyone, whether we dislike it or not, everyone does catch a snippet of, and the media, of course, if there's a quick-witted comment in there, the media seize upon that and show that regularly on the television. So we don't get a snapshot, a proper snapshot of what actually happens in Parliament. And there are some very good, very healthy debates which are dealt with in a calm manner. Can we reform PMQs? It really depends on the personalities that are in Parliament at the time. And I think there is room for the social composition of Parliament to reflect modern Britain, and hopefully to reflect the fact that there should be some decorum in Parliament. It does rely on a strong speaker in the House. Under Betty Boothroyd, some will remember, she was pretty tough with, and she was a woman in Parliament, pretty tough with how she dealt with the other parliamentarians. So there is a lot that can be done, but I would urge you, I mean, you're probably not going to find it fascinating. It's like people who watch Silk and think that that's the life of a barrister at the bar. There's a lot of sensationalisation that goes on, and actually some of the great work that we do doesn't get televised.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and get 2 more questions in before we finish. So, Julian, this question on immigration. Have we got the balance in immigration right? And just a general question, are there any parties wanting immigration to actually increase, as many economics or economists suggest this would benefit the economy? So it seems all the parties are talking about how much they would reduce it by. Are there any parties saying they want it to increase or benefit?
But I don't think we've ever said we want to reduce immigration. I think we benefit massively from migration. We are an international trading nation. And the net benefits, if you look at economic studies, are clear. We are better off as a result. And we're better off getting people from Europe, and we're better off getting people from outside Europe. And I'm always very clear about saying that. There are certainly challenges in some places. If you have too many people going somewhere, that can put pressure on housing or school places, for example. And the solution isn't to blame the foreigners, it's to build a bigger school or build some more houses. It's to address those problems. Roughly 1 in 7 companies were set up by migrants. Students are one of our country's biggest exports. So we should do much, much more to encourage that. We should control the rules, absolutely. We should clamp down on abuse. We should bring in exit checks, which we've been pushing for, so that it's a bit odd that we have no idea who's leaving the country. So it should be a competent system. but we shouldn't scapegoat. And actually, for me, the biggest problem about the rise of UKIP hasn't been the fact that they're going to win some seats in Parliament, because they're going to hardly win any, hasn't been the votes they'll get, although it'll be too many for my taste. It's the fact they've opened the debate up for many people who are genuinely xenophobic, who are just blaming foreigners for the problems of the world. And I think that's a huge problem. It's been really painful over the last 5 years to see the Tories chase that way time and time again in some of Theresa May's rhetoric and actions, and see Labour chasing exactly the same way with some really unpleasant things. Labour actually selling mugs championing controlling immigration. It's described by Diane Abbott, Labour MP, as shameful, embarrassing, and not as bad as the policy.
Rupert, we have the same question.
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to say about this is that I think we really need to think beyond the question of what's good for the economy. You know, when I'm asked a question about immigration, I don't just want to answer it in terms of, oh well, if we let more of a certain kind of immigrant in, it'll be better for the economy, and if we don't, it won't, or whatever. We need to remind ourselves of what the economy is for. Right? There's been too much slavish serving of the economy over the last generation. The economy exists to serve society, not the other way around. So let's think about what kind of society we want to have. And let's think about human equality. Let's think about immigration in terms of it being about human beings. That's what matters. And so that's why we in the Greens take a very strong view that the part of immigration that is actually the most important is family reunification. Right? When you've got people being cruelly separated from their spouse or other close family members, that's what we think is the most unjust part of some of the current immigration regulations. So we're not, like some other parties, thinking, oh, let's have some kind of clever point system so we can get in people who are going to give us an economic boost. What we ought to be thinking about is of immigration as an issue that involves fundamentally human beings, human lives, families. And so that's another reason, I think that just strengthens the point about why it's so crucial to oppose xenophobia, and we in the Greens have been absolutely relentless in opposing UKIP xenophobia and the tendencies in that direction that you sometimes find in other parties. Final point. Insofar as there are any problems with the numbers of immigration that we have in the world today, if there are, then what we need to do is tackle the reasons why human beings migrate so much. So the real way to deal with immigration, if we need to deal with it, is to tackle dangerous climate change, wars of aggression, human rights abuses around the world. We need to stop arms exports to regimes where those arms are going to be used against their own people. Those are all things that Greens feel passionately about. That's the real way to humanely handle the pressures that cause people to migrate in such numbers sometimes in the first place.
Thank you very much. Chuan, same question to you.
I actually think immigration is a very big topic. I was born and raised in Leicester, which has a large migrant community from all parts of the world. And sometimes people have come as refugees, sometimes people have come as economic migrants. Do we have the balance right? Probably not. Do we feel it in Cambridge? No, we don't. In Cambridge, we're actually very proud of our migrant community. Most people who come to Cambridge as migrants are coming to contribute very effectively to the society, lift Cambridge up to the status that we have of pioneers in technology and science. They're coming to study at the university. They're making a really positive contribution. So immigration isn't an issue necessarily in this seat. But go to Leicester, immigration is an issue where indigenous people of Britain aren't getting access to public sector services or aren't getting preferences in terms of housing when they're looking for social housing. So there are issues in different parts of the country, and I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all philosophy. Julian's absolutely right on entrance and exit checks. We do need to know how many people are coming into the country so we can adequately provide the public sector services for those people. There's a lot to be said actually about immigration. I represented in the largest passport fraud and illegal immigration smuggling ring to the UK, and that was in 2006. And the conditions by which people came to this country and struggled and suffered, yet they paid so much money to get these false, fake passports. It was a real scandal. Yet in that case, as the prosecution, they showed a video of the ringleaders. Sorry, I know I'm conscious of time, but it's quite an interesting one. They showed the ringleader's house at his pool party. He was drinking a glass of champagne, and he said, "I would like to salute Her Majesty the Queen for giving me this opportunity to make money." So people suffered to come to this country. There's a lot we need to do. We need to clamp down on abuses. We haven't got it right. partly because we've struggled to talk about this subject, but we are now talking about it, and there's much more to do that can be addressed in 2 minutes.
Daniel.
Anyone who thinks immigration doesn't matter obviously hasn't been listening to the British people. It does matter. It matters on the doorstep in Cambridge. I hear it all the time. And part of the problem is that David Cameron made a very, very foolish promise at the last election, which he couldn't possibly keep. His net migration target was impossible while we're part of the European Union. And so it is proved. And that's meant that many people feel, yet again, they're being completely let down by politicians. Let's be clear about Labour's position on immigration. We think immigration has been good for the economy. We think particularly in a city like Cambridge, where foreign students contribute hugely, and let's be clear, higher education is one of our biggest exports. It's worth £10 billion a year to this country. And sending a message out to other parts of the world that foreign students aren't welcome anymore was a really daft thing to do. So we're positive about that, but also we understand why people feel unhappy in some places. If you're a low-paid worker and you've got someone coming to do your job for half the pay, you're worried about that, and we understand that. But the way you do it is not scapegoat migrants, it's actually to protect low-paid people. That's why we need stronger employment laws, and not just laws, but enforcement. So things like the Gang Master Licensing Authority, which we set up in the first place, will extend that to other sectors, will actually give people some confidence that the migration system works. At the moment, people don't have that. But don't underestimate it. It's a really serious problem. To pretend that it isn't, I'm afraid, will just feed UKIP in future.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our final question, and we'll just have a minute from each person on this, and some form of closing statement as well. And the final question is this, in this 1 minute. Who inspires you and why? You may wish to choose your respective party leaders, or you may wish to look further afield.
Oh, God. I always hate this bit. It's like a radio interview where somebody says to me, you know, what's your favourite song, what's your most guilty pleasure, etc. It's the bit I find the hardest. All right. Who inspires me? Well, I am very inspired by Caroline Lucas, who I've known and worked with closely for many years. One of the reasons I want to be an MP is to give more power to her, and I think she's been an absolutely fantastic parliamentarian. In terms of people from the past, I take a great inspiration from Gandhi. I've been involved in quite a lot of non-violent direct action myself over the years, trying to defend animals, opposing nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. And I think Gandhi was an inspiration because he led a movement involving non-violent direct action, and he actually won, and that shows that it can be done. And the final example I'm going to pick is a slightly esoteric one. I'm a philosopher, and my man Ludwig Wittgenstein is a great inspiration. Probably won't mean much to many of you, but he's an amazing philosopher of language with very deep ideas also about religion and spirituality. So yeah, that's my three: Caroline, Gandhi, and Wittgenstein. Yeah.
Very good. Daniel.
Right, I have to say people who inspire me most generally are local people who do things, and I'm actually inspired by some of the people at Cambridge United Football Club, not just for creating a better football club, but for the work they do with young people. That's the kind of inspiration that really works. When I saw Jez George coming into the stadium a couple of years ago with thousands and thousands of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds coming in behind him after one of his long walks around the country, that's inspiration. But you do want a political inspiration? Well, actually, in my own party, John Cruddas inspires me quite often because he talks a different kind of politics than most politicians. And the thing that he said a couple of years ago, which I think we should perhaps listen to a bit more often, is that what politics needs is a bit more love. And I agree with him.
Thank you very much. And Jamali, who inspires you?
There's a couple of people. Actually, I agree with Rupert in terms of Gandhi. I think the peace-love approach was remarkable for his time. I had the privilege when I was 5 years old of meeting the first female Prime Minister in the world. She was the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. And I looked at her and I thought, wow, if you can do it, you look like my grandma. You set a benchmark for other people. Who inspires me the most is probably my mother. I do talk about her a lot. She's been extremely supportive. I know that I would not be here today if not for her quick-witted skills during the time that I was born that helped me survive. Because my mum did the delivery herself and then went on to lecture and in midwifery and train new nurses coming through the system, as well as contributing 20 years of her life to the National Health Service. She was also a lay magistrate for 20 years as well. So my mother is probably the biggest influence and biggest inspiration on my life. And it takes me to where I see this city going. I genuinely want Cambridge to become the global benchmark for a greener, fairer, sustainable society. And I believe it's possible. I'm here because of my mother, and I believe that if you come with me, we can go on that journey together.
Thank you very much. And Julian?
It's a very tough question. I was quite amused to see that Caroline Lucas and John Crudders are both people I've worked with, so nice to see those. But philosophically, the two people I would probably pick up are John Stuart Mill and Rawls. I think both of them say some very interesting... I don't agree with everything they've ever written. I haven't read everything they've ever written either. But it would be something like that. But then actually, I hope it doesn't sound too much like Jemima, too much like I'm copying her. Family. My father, my mother, my brother, I've learnt a huge amount from them. You know, my mother's experience being born in a refugee camp, how she went from being in a refugee camp in Uzbekistan in 1945 to being here in Cambridge. Very complex story. And a lot of my drive to do something worthwhile with my life stems from the fact that I know I've had a much easier start here than she had there, and wanting to do something about that through St John Ambulance, through politics, through a whole range of things. But actually, in some ways, the day-to-day thing, I was thinking back, I mentioned right at the beginning, I've dealt with these 32,000 pieces of casework. And it takes a lot of time and effort, and it can be incredibly frustrating. But actually, when you hear some of the stories, and then when you manage to fix somebody's problem, that's probably actually the thing that keeps me going from day to day the most.
Okay, we're going to have to finish there. Thank you very much to all the candidates. I would like to sincerely thank them both for being here this evening, but also, I don't think you get to be a parliamentary candidate without having committed a huge amount of your time and effort to people in this community, so we're very, very grateful for that. It's with some sadness I say that actually I think there's something in our society that's often cynical about politicians in general, but when people have met politicians, local politicians or national politicians, they find them to be deeply sincere, compassionate and impressive people. So thank you all very much. We wish you all well. Obviously, not all of you can win, but whoever wins, congratulations. We do wish you all well for the future and for everything that you do for the city. So give them a round of applause. Thank you. I'd like to mention on the ticket, I think there are two other people. Patrick O'Flynn from UKIP, who got some mention tonight, was invited but was unable to make it, but he is also a candidate. And Keith Garrett is standing as an independent candidate, so in 10 days' time you'll be able to vote for one of these four candidates here or either of those other two. As Steve said this morning, it's in no way the place of the church to say who you should vote for, but we would strongly encourage you to vote. This is a hotly contested seat in an incredibly hotly contested election, so it's a really excellent opportunity to make your voice heard, so please do vote. Round of applause again for these four guys.